U.S. Colonel thought the veteran was too old to shoot until he saw him reload without missing a beat. Sometimes the most dangerous mistake is dismissing someone based on appearances alone, and the most sacred traditions are carried by those who seem the most ordinary. This is the story of how one elderly man's annual pilgrimage to a Marine sniper range exposed a commanding officer's arrogance and revealed that some debts of honor transcend rank, time, and even death itself. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center sniper range as 81-year-old Raymond Hunt stepped through the security checkpoint, carrying a worn leather rifle case that had clearly seen decades of use. His movements were deliberate and measured, the careful gait of someone whose body had been shaped by age but whose mind remained sharp and focused on a specific purpose that had brought him to this place at this particular time. Raymond wore a faded windbreaker over a shooting jacket that showed its age in every thread. The fabric worn thin at the elbows, the color bleached by countless hours under harsh sunlight, and most notably, a military unit patch on the shoulder that had faded almost beyond recognition. To the casual observer, he appeared to be exactly what he seemed, an elderly veteran indulging in nostalgia by visiting a military facility that held personal significance from his younger days. But there was something about Raymond's bearing that suggested depths beyond simple nostalgia. His pale blue eyes held the kind of calm steadiness that came not from confidence, but from having faced challenges that most people could never imagine. His weathered hands, visible as he signed the visitor log, showed no tremor despite his advanced age, a detail that would have been significant to anyone who understood the physical demands of precision marksmanship. The checkpoint guard, a young corporal who had been assigned to gate duty as part of his rotation through various base positions, processed Raymond's paperwork with the efficient courtesy that was standard for civilian visitors to military installations. "Sir, it shows here that you've requested access to Range 4 for 1 hour of supervised shooting. Is that correct?" Raymond nodded with the quiet courtesy that seemed to characterize all his interactions. "Yes, that's correct. I come here every year on this date, and I've cleared it with the Range Operations Office according to the procedures they provided me." The corporal consulted his computer terminal, confirming that Raymond's request had indeed been properly documented and approved by Range Operations staff. "Everything appears to be in order, sir. You'll need to check in with the range officer on duty, and he'll assign you a safety supervisor for your shooting session." As Raymond walked toward the main range office, he passed groups of young Marines who were conducting their own qualification training, men in their 20s, whose precision rifle skills represented the current generation of Marine Corps snipers. They watched with casual interest as the elderly civilian made his way past their firing positions, probably assuming he was a retired Marine who had arranged for some recreational shooting time as a courtesy extended to veterans. Inside the range office, Colonel Marcus Thorne sat behind his desk, reviewing paperwork related to training schedules and ammunition expenditure reports. At 52, Thorne had achieved his rank through steady administrative competence rather than combat distinction. His career had been built on managing budgets, maintaining facilities, and ensuring that training operations ran smoothly according to regulations and protocols. When Raymond entered the office and approached Thorne's desk with his rifle case, the colonel looked up with barely concealed irritation at this interruption to his administrative duties. "Can I help you?" Thorne asked, his tone suggesting that whatever assistance he might provide would be grudging and minimal. "Colonel Thorne, I'm Raymond Hunt. I have a scheduled appointment to use Range 4 for 1 hour this afternoon. The Range Operations Office approved my request 3 weeks ago, and I've brought all the required documentation regarding my civilian shooting certifications." Thorne leaned back in his chair and studied Raymond with the kind of assessment that immediately categorized people based on superficial observations. What he saw was an old man in worn clothes, carrying equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum, and his expression showed exactly what he thought of this situation. "Mr. Hunt, I'm looking at my schedule and I see your request here, but I'm going to be honest with you. I don't understand why range operations approved this in the first place. This is an active Marine Corps sniper training facility, not a recreational shooting club for civilians who want to relive their glory days." Raymond's expression remained neutral despite the dismissive tone. "Colonel, I understand your concern about facility use, but I've been coming here annually for over 2 decades. The previous range commanders have all accommodated my requests because they understood the significance of—" "The significance of what?" Thorn interrupted, his voice rising slightly as he warmed to what he perceived as an opportunity to demonstrate his authority. "The significance of an elderly civilian taking up valuable range time that should be dedicated to training active duty Marines? I don't care what previous commanders allowed. I'm in charge now, and I run this facility according to proper priorities." Gunnery Sergeant Tom Miller, who had been working at a desk in the corner of the office, looked up with obvious discomfort at his commander's treatment of the visitor. Miller was a career Marine with 23 years of service, much of it spent as a sniper instructor, and his instincts told him that there was more to this situation than Thorn's quick assessment had revealed. "Sir," Miller interjected carefully, "Mr. Hunt's paperwork shows that he's fully certified for civilian marksmanship. He's provided proof of insurance, and his request was processed through proper channels. We do have the range time available since today's qualification schedule doesn't fully book Range 4. Thorn turned toward Miller with the kind of sharp attention that senior officers used when subordinates questioned their judgment. "Gunnery Sergeant, I don't recall asking for your operational analysis. If I want input about how to manage this facility's schedule, I'll request it directly." The public rebuke silenced Miller, but his discomfort with the situation continued to grow as he watched Thorn return his attention to Raymond with obvious contempt for the elderly visitor's presence. "Mr. Hunt," Thorn continued, standing up and walking around his desk to examine Raymond more closely, "let me see these hands of yours that supposedly still have the steadiness for precision shooting." Raymond extended his hands without comment, holding them palm down at shoulder height in a position that would reveal any tremor or instability. Thorn examined them with exaggerated scrutiny, clearly expecting to find evidence of age-related shaking that would justify denying the range request on safety grounds. What he saw made him frown with surprise. Raymond's hands were absolutely steady, showing none of the tremor that was common in people decades younger than him. The steadiness suggested not just good health, but extensive training and muscle control that had been maintained through decades of practice. Frustrated that he couldn't identify an obvious safety justification for denial, Thorn shifted his attack to Raymond's equipment and appearance. "And what about this shooting jacket you're wearing? It looks like something you pulled out of a Vietnam War memorabilia collection. That patch on your shoulder is so faded I can barely make out what unit it's supposed to represent." Raymond glanced down at the worn patch with an expression that suggested it held profound personal significance, despite its deteriorated condition. "It's from my unit, Colonel. I've maintained this jacket since my service ended because it reminds me of the people I served with and the responsibilities we carried together." Thorn laughed, a harsh sound that made Miller wince with embarrassment on behalf of his service and his command. "Mr. Hunt, this facility is about current combat readiness, not about preserving museum exhibits from conflicts that ended before most of my Marines were born. Your sentimental attachment to old equipment doesn't give you priority access to training facilities that are needed for preparing warriors who are actually going to face modern combat conditions." The colonel's voice had risen enough that Marines working in adjacent offices had begun paying attention to the confrontation, creating an audience for what was becoming a public humiliation of an elderly veteran at the hands of a commanding officer who seemed determined to demonstrate his authority. "Colonel Thorn," Raymond said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of dignity that came from having nothing left to prove to anyone. "I'm not asking for priority access or special treatment. I'm simply requesting to fulfill a commitment that I made a long time ago to someone who can't be here himself. The Range Operations Office understood the situation and approved my request according to proper procedures." Thorne's expression hardened as he interpreted Raymond's calm response as subtle defiance of his authority. "Gunnery Sergeant Miller, I want you to escort Mr. Hunt off this facility immediately. His request is denied on the grounds that his presence would interfere with active training operations, and that his equipment doesn't meet current safety standards for use on Marine Corps ranges." Miller stood up slowly, his reluctance obvious to everyone in the office. "Sir, with respect, Mr. Hunt's equipment has been previously inspected and approved by range safety officers. I'm not sure we have grounds to—" "Gunnery Sergeant," Thorne's voice cut through Miller's objection like a blade. "Are you refusing to follow a direct order from your commanding officer?" Miller felt the weight of that question and understood that his career could be affected by how he responded in this moment. "No, sir. I'll escort Mr. Hunt to the exit." As Miller approached Raymond to guide him out of the office, he noticed something that made his instincts scream that they were making a terrible mistake. The faded patch on Raymond's jacket, which Thorne had dismissed as meaningless memorabilia, showed a design that Miller recognized from his extensive study of Marine Corps sniper history. A ghost figure superimposed over crosshairs, with text that was barely legible, but that Miller could just make out as reading something about spectral operations. "Mr. Hunt," Miller said quietly as they walked toward the exit, "would you mind waiting on that bench in the shade while I make a quick phone call? I think there might be some confusion that I can clear up with a couple of contacts I have at headquarters." Raymond nodded with understanding, recognizing that the gunnery sergeant was trying to help despite being constrained by his orders and his position in the chain of command. As he settled onto the bench to wait, Raymond's mind drifted back 50 years to another hot afternoon when he had made a promise to a dying friend, a promise that had brought him back to this place every year since, regardless of the obstacles or the reception he received from people who didn't understand what sacred obligations really meant. Gunnery Sergeant Miller moved quickly to a quiet corner of the facility where he could make his phone call without being overheard by Colonel Thorne or the other personnel who were now watching the situation unfold with growing discomfort. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed the number for Master Sergeant James Davis, a career Marine with connections throughout the Corps' institutional memory, who served as an informal resource for matters involving veteran affairs and historical unit information. Davis answered on the second ring with his characteristic efficiency. "Master Sergeant Davis." "Gunny Davis, this is Tom Miller from the Mountain Warfare Sniper Range. I need some quick information about a civilian visitor who just got denied range access by our commanding officer. The man's name is Raymond Hunt, and he's wearing what looks like an old unit patch that I think might be from some kind of specialized sniper unit from Vietnam era." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted long enough that Miller wondered if the connection had been lost. When Davis finally spoke, his voice carried an urgency that made Miller's stomach tighten with the realization that something significant was happening. "Miller, did you say Raymond Hunt? Elderly gentleman, probably in his 80s, very calm demeanor, wearing a faded shooting jacket with a nearly invisible unit patch." "Yes, that's an exact description. How did you do?" "Miller, listen to me very carefully," Davis interrupted, his voice taking on command authority that transcended his rank. "Do not let that man leave your facility under any circumstances. I don't care what your commander ordered. You keep Raymond Hunt there until I can get the right people notified about this situation." Miller felt his heart rate increase as he processed the implications of Davis's reaction. "Gunny, what's going on? Who exactly is this guy?" "I can't explain everything over an unsecured line, but Raymond Hunt is not just any veteran. His name appears in classified training materials, and his annual visit to your range has been officially sanctioned at levels that go well above facility command. If your colonel denied him access, he just made a career-ending mistake." The call ended abruptly as Davis presumably began making other urgent contacts, leaving Miller standing with his phone in his hand, and a growing sense that he had just witnessed the beginning of something that would have significant consequences for everyone involved. Back in the range office, Colonel Thorne had returned to his paperwork with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully established his authority over an administrative challenge. He had effectively dismissed the elderly civilian's sentimental requests and reasserted that the facility's priorities were determined by him rather than by outdated traditions or accommodations made by previous commanders who had been too soft on maintaining proper standards. His self-satisfaction was interrupted by the arrival of one of his junior officers, a lieutenant who served as the facility's operations officer. "Sir, Gunnery Sergeant Miller asked me to inform you that he's made contact with headquarters regarding Mr. Hunt's visit. He suggested that you might want to delay any final decisions about the range access until he receives confirmation about some procedural matters." Thorne's face reddened with anger at what he perceived as Miller undermining his authority by appealing to higher command without his permission. "Lieutenant, you can inform Gunnery Sergeant Miller that I don't need headquarters confirmation to manage my own facility. The decision about Mr. Hunt's access has been made, and it stands regardless of whatever connections Miller thinks he can leverage to second-guess my judgment." The lieutenant shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that he was caught between conflicting instructions from senior personnel whose authority he wasn't qualified to adjudicate. "Yes, sir. I'll relay your response to the gunnery sergeant." As the lieutenant departed, Thorne stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the main range area. He could see Raymond Hunt sitting calmly on the bench where Miller had left him, apparently content to wait rather than causing any scene or demanding immediate attention. The old man's quiet dignity irritated Thorne even more than open protest would have. It suggested a confidence that seemed completely unjustified given his position as a civilian visitor, being denied access to a military facility. Making a decision that would prove catastrophic to his career, Thorne decided to personally ensure that the elderly visitor understood his complete lack of authority or significance in this situation. He walked out of his office and crossed the open area toward the bench where Raymond waited, his stride purposeful, and his expression showing the kind of aggressive confidence that people in positions of power sometimes displayed when dealing with those they considered subordinate. "Mr. Hunt," Thorne announced loudly enough for nearby Marines to hear, "I understand that Gunnery Sergeant Miller suggested you wait while he made some phone calls. I'm here to inform you that whatever contacts he thinks he has at headquarters, they don't override my authority as commander of this facility. Your request for range access has been denied, and I'm now going to ask you to leave this installation immediately." Raymond looked up at Thorne with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout their earlier encounter. "Colonel, I respect your authority over this facility, but I would appreciate the opportunity to wait until Gunnery Sergeant Miller completes his communications with headquarters, just to ensure that all proper procedures have been followed." Thorne interpreted Raymond's polite persistence as subtle defiance that needed to be crushed publicly to maintain his authority in front of the Marines, who were now openly watching this confrontation. "Mr. Hunt, I don't think you understand your position here. You are a civilian visitor who has been denied access based on operational priorities. You have no authority to remain on this facility against my direct order, and if you refuse to leave voluntarily, I will have security escort you off the premises." Several young Marines who were observing this scene felt growing discomfort with their commander's treatment of an elderly veteran. While they didn't know the specific details of Raymond's background or the significance of his visit, their training and their cultural understanding of Marine Corps values suggested that something was very wrong about the way this situation was being handled. Private First Class Rodriguez, one of the youngest Marines present, leaned toward his fellow sniper student and whispered, "This doesn't feel right, man. The colonel is treating that old guy like he's some kind of troublemaker instead of a veteran who probably served before we were born." His companion nodded with obvious agreement. Yeah, and did you see how steady his hands were when the colonel made him hold them out? That's not normal for someone his age. That kind of control suggests serious training that was maintained for decades." Their whispered conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Gunnery Sergeant Miller, who jogged across the range area with obvious urgency and approached Colonel Thorne with barely controlled anxiety about the situation that was rapidly escalating beyond simple administrative disagreement. "Sir, "I need to speak with you privately about Mr. Hunt's visit," Miller said quietly, hoping to pull Thorne away from the public confrontation before additional damage was done. Thorne turned toward Miller with obvious irritation at this interruption of his demonstration of authority. "Gunnery Sergeant, I told you that my decision stands regardless of whatever phone calls you made. This facility's operations are my responsibility, and I don't appreciate subordinates undermining my commands by appealing to outside contacts." Miller felt his professional reputation and possibly his career hanging in the balance, but his instincts and his understanding of Marine Corps tradition told him that he had to try one more time to prevent what he now understood would be a catastrophic mistake. "Sir, with all due respect, I strongly recommend that you delay any final action regarding Mr. Hunt until we receive confirmation from headquarters about the nature of his annual visits to this range. There are historical and traditional factors involved that I don't think we fully understand." Thorne's expression shifted from irritation to cold anger at what he perceived as insubordination disguised as cautious advice. "Gunnery Sergeant Miller, you are relieved from duty for the remainder of the day. Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning to discuss your apparent inability to follow direct orders from your commanding officer." The public relief of a respected gunnery sergeant sent a shock through the assembled Marines, who understood that they were witnessing not just a dispute about range access, but a fundamental conflict about leadership, respect, and the values that were supposed to define their service. As Miller stepped back from the confrontation, defeated by the realities of military hierarchy and chain of command, the sound of approaching vehicles drew everyone's attention toward the facility entrance, where a convoy of official command cars was moving at high speed toward the range area with enough urgency to suggest that something significant was about to occur. Master Sergeant James Davis burst through the door of General William Peterson's office without the courtesy of waiting for his aide's permission, his urgency overriding normal military protocol in a way that immediately commanded the general's full attention. Peterson looked up from the briefing documents he had been reviewing with sharp focus, recognizing that Davis wouldn't violate proper procedures unless the situation genuinely required immediate command intervention. "General, we have a situation at the Mountain Warfare Sniper Range that requires your immediate personal attention. Colonel Thorne has denied range access to Raymond Hunt and is in the process of having him forcibly removed from the facility." Peterson felt his blood pressure spike as he processed the name and its implications. Raymond Hunt wasn't just any veteran or civilian shooting enthusiast. He was a living legend whose name appeared in the most classified corners of Marine Corps sniper training history, and whose annual pilgrimage to Range 4 had been officially sanctioned at levels that transcended facility command authority. "Are you certain of the identification?" Peterson asked, though he was already reaching for his cover and preparing to depart immediately. "Positive, sir. The description matches archived photographs, and the gunnery sergeant who contacted me reported that Hunt is wearing his original unit jacket with the faded patch. Colonel Thorne apparently dismissed him as an elderly nuisance and publicly humiliated him in front of active duty Marines." General Peterson's expression shifted to barely controlled fury as he understood the full magnitude of what had occurred. "Get my car ready immediately and notify Sergeant Major Wilson that he's coming with me. Also contact the Commandant's office and inform them that we have a situation involving the Range 4 memorial tradition. They'll understand what that means." As Davis rushed to execute these orders, Peterson pulled out a secure phone and made a direct call to the Marine Corps Historical Division, requesting immediate transmission of Raymond Hunt's service record summary and the official documentation regarding his annual range visits. What he received within minutes confirmed everything he needed to know and intensified his determination to personally address the situation before any additional damage was done. The drive from headquarters to the Mountain Warfare Training Center normally took 45 minutes, but Peterson's driver made it in 30, using command priority and emergency protocols to clear traffic and ensure maximum speed. Throughout the journey, Peterson reviewed the historical documents that had been transmitted to his tablet, refreshing his memory about details that he had learned years earlier, but that had taken on new urgency given the current situation. Raymond Ghost Hunt had been one of the most effective snipers in Marine Corps history during the Vietnam conflict, achieving a confirmed kill count that remained classified, but that was legendary among those with access to the full records. His call sign, Ghost, had been earned through his ability to remain undetected while conducting reconnaissance and precision fire missions that had saved countless American lives and disrupted enemy operations across multiple theaters of the conflict. But the most significant aspect of Hunt's service, and the reason for his annual pilgrimage to Range 4, involved his partnership with Spotter Corporal Daniel Ames. The two Marines had worked together for 18 months in some of the most dangerous operations of the war, developing the kind of combat partnership that transcended normal military relationships and became a bond that continued beyond death itself. On the exact date that Raymond was now visiting the range, 50 years earlier, Corporal Ames had been killed by enemy fire while the team was conducting a reconnaissance mission. Raymond had completed the mission alone, then carried his partner's body through hostile territory for 3 days to ensure he received proper military honors rather than being left behind in the jungle. The tradition of Raymond's annual visit to Range 4 had begun years after the war, when he had learned that the Marine Corps was building a new sniper training facility. He had requested permission to visit the range on the anniversary of his partner's death, and every commandant since had personally approved this request as a sacred obligation that honored not just Raymond and Daniel, but the entire tradition of Marine sniper partnerships. As Peterson's convoy approached the training center entrance, he could see through the main gate that a crowd had gathered near Range 4. Marines who had apparently stopped their own training to observe whatever was happening at that location. The presence of so many witnesses meant that Thorne's mishandling of the situation had become a public spectacle that would require equally public correction. Back at Range 4, Colonel Thorne had escalated his confrontation with Raymond to the point of calling base security to physically escort the elderly veteran off the facility. 2 military police personnel had arrived and were standing uncomfortably nearby, clearly reluctant to forcibly remove an elderly man who showed no signs of aggressive or disruptive behavior, beyond politely requesting to wait for clarification from higher command. "Officers," Thorne instructed the military police with obvious impatience, "this civilian has been ordered to leave the facility and is refusing to comply. I want him escorted to the front gate immediately and barred from future access to this installation." The senior military police officer, a staff sergeant with 12 years of experience, studied the situation with obvious unease about what he was being asked to do. "Sir, the individual doesn't appear to be causing any disturbance or safety issue. Are you certain you want us to physically escort him off the premises?" Thorne's face reddened with anger at having his order questioned by yet another subordinate. "Staff Sergeant, I am the commanding officer of this facility, and I have determined that this civilian's presence is disruptive to training operations. Execute my order immediately, or I'll have you written up for failure to follow lawful commands." As the military police officers reluctantly approached Raymond to begin the escort process, the sound of multiple vehicles arriving at high speed drew everyone's attention toward the convoy that was pulling up to Range 4 with obvious urgency. The lead vehicle bore flags marking it as carrying general officer personnel, and the precision with which the convoy had arrived suggested this was an official response rather than coincidental timing. General Peterson emerged from his vehicle before it had completely stopped, his expression showing carefully controlled anger that every Marine present immediately recognized as indicating serious consequences for someone. Behind him came Sergeant Major Wilson and several other senior personnel whose presence transformed the casual range environment into something approaching a formal ceremony. Thorne felt his confident authority beginning to crack as he recognized that his handling of Raymond Hunt's visit had somehow triggered response from the highest levels of his command structure. He attempted to salute the general and provide a situational report, but Peterson walked past him without acknowledgement, his attention focused entirely on the elderly man who was still sitting calmly on the bench, despite being surrounded by military police and subjected to public humiliation by the facility commander. When General Peterson reached Raymond Hunt, he came to perfect attention and rendered the most formal military salute that any of the watching Marines had ever witnessed, a gesture held for the full regulation time and executed with the kind of precision that indicated profound personal respect rather than mere protocol. "Mr. Hunt," Peterson said formally, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent range, "on behalf of the United States Marine Corps and the Commandant himself, I apologize for the treatment you have received here today. Please accept my assurance that this situation will be addressed immediately and comprehensively." Raymond slowly stood and returned the salute with movements that seemed to strip away his 81 years, revealing glimpses of the Marine he had been during his service decades earlier. Every person present understood they were witnessing something significant, though most of them still didn't understand the full context that had triggered such an extraordinary response from their commanding general. General Peterson turned to address the assembled Marines. "You are in the presence of Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Hunt, retired, United States Marine Corps. During Vietnam, Gunnery Sergeant Hunt achieved a combat record that remains classified, but represents some of the most effective sniper operations in Corps history." The revelation that Raymond held senior enlisted rank immediately shifted the atmosphere. Gunnery Sergeant Hunt's call sign was Ghost because enemy forces could never locate his position, despite his devastating effectiveness. His tactical innovations are still taught in advanced sniper schools, though most instructors don't know the Marine who developed them. Peterson gestured toward Raymond's faded jacket. "That patch represents one of the most classified special operations units in Marine Corps history. These Marines operated in absolute secrecy, their achievements never publicly recognized." The general's voice became reverent. "Gunnery Sergeant Hunt comes to Range 4 every year on this date to honor his spotter, Corporal Daniel Ames, who was killed in action exactly 50 years ago today." After Corporal Ames was killed, Gunnery Sergeant Hunt completed their mission alone, then carried his partner's body through 3 days of hostile territory to ensure he received proper military honors. The watching Marines felt tears gathering as they contemplated the loyalty that had brought this veteran back for 5 decades. This annual visit has been officially sanctioned by every commandant since this facility was built. When Gunnery Sergeant Hunt requests access to Range 4, he exercises a right granted at the highest levels as recognition of his service and commitment to honoring his fallen partner. Peterson turned toward Thorne with cold fury. "Colonel Thorne, you have publicly humiliated a Marine whose service exceeds anything you or I will ever achieve. You dismissed his credentials, mocked his equipment, and ordered his forcible removal from a facility where his presence is officially honored." Thorne stood frozen, his face pale as he understood the magnitude of his error. "You did this in front of young Marines, watching to see how leaders treat veterans. Your actions violated every principle we claim to value about respect and tradition." Peterson addressed Sergeant Major Wilson. "Colonel Thorne is relieved of command effective immediately. He will report to my office tomorrow to discuss his future, which will involve administrative duties without Marine or veteran interaction. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, you are appointed acting commander. I understand you attempted to prevent this situation by contacting higher command when you recognized the significance." Peterson turned to Raymond, his expression softening. "Gunnery Sergeant Hunt, Range 4 is yours for as long as you wish. Every Marine here now understands the significance of your presence." "Thank you, General. I'd like to proceed with what I came here to do." As Raymond walked toward Range 4 with his rifle case, every Marine came to attention in spontaneous respect, understanding they witnessed the continuation of a sacred tradition connecting them to their Corps' history and sacrifices made by Marines whose names they would never know, but whose legacy they carried forward. 6 months later, Marcus Thorne navigated a garden center in suburban San Diego, far from military facilities where he'd once wielded authority. His Pentagon reassignment processing budget reports had been exactly as humiliating as intended. He couldn't affect Marines, but would spend years reviewing supply requisitions. The demotion had cost him his marriage. He lived alone, spending weekends tending a modest garden that had become his refuge. As Thorne examined tomato seedlings, he noticed Raymond Hunt selecting seed packets nearby. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. His first instinct was to leave, but he remembered Raymond's words. "It's not about what you did wrong. It's about what you do next." Taking a breath and summoning courage, Thorne approached. "Mr. Hunt, I know I have no right to speak with you, but I wanted to say I'm sorry for how I treated you. Not just because it cost my career, but because I finally understand how completely wrong I was about everything that mattered." Raymond studied Thorne's face, seeing genuine humility and hard-won wisdom. "What are you doing these days?" "Processing budget reports in a windowless office and learning to grow tomatoes. The tomatoes are proving more rewarding." Raymond smiled. Tomatoes teach patience, attention to detail, and understanding that healthy growth requires proper conditions and careful tending. They moved to a bench outside. Thorne continued, "I've spent 6 months learning about your service. I read everything about sniper partnerships and bonds between Marines in combat. I finally understand what I dismissed as sentimental nostalgia was actually one of the most sacred obligations Marines can honor. I learned about Corporal Ames and your final mission. I realized my entire career of administrative competence meant nothing compared to what you accomplished under conditions I can't comprehend. The hardest lesson has been accepting that I believed authority and respect were the same thing, that my position entitled me to deference without earning it through character and wisdom." Raymond was quiet before responding. "Colonel, what you did wasn't acceptable, and you should feel regret. You hurt people, including young Marines watching to learn from leaders' examples. But growth and change are still possible at any stage, and your 6 months of genuine learning suggests you're on a better path now. Mr. Hunt, could I ask about your garden? I'm still learning and would appreciate advice." Raymond smiled. "The most important thing is understanding every plant is different and requires attention to specific needs. You can't force growth through authority or impatience. You must learn to read what each plant tells you and respond with appropriate care." As they discussed tomato varieties and soil amendments, both understood they were really discussing personal growth, character development, and patient cultivation of wisdom that came only through humility. Before parting, Raymond shared final wisdom. "Colonel, the soil you're working with now might feel like punishment or limitation. But the best gardens are often grown in challenging conditions by people who learn to work with what they have. Focus on growing something valuable from where you are, and you might find the harvest exceeds anything you achieved when you had more authority and less wisdom." Months later, Thorne established a Veterans Garden project, bringing retired Marines together to grow produce for food banks, while sharing stories and building community across generations. The project became his redemption and legacy, demonstrating that even catastrophic failures could eventually produce something valuable when followed by genuine learning and humble service. Raymond continued his annual pilgrimage to Range 4, honored by every commanding officer understanding that some traditions connected them to sacred bonds defining their corps across decades. His shooting jacket with faded patch hung in his closet waiting for next year's visit, while Raymond found peace not in rifle fire, but in the quiet satisfaction of his garden, where patience, attention, and respect for living things produced growth lasting beyond any single season.